Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Reimagining the Future of Our Nation's Food, a panel to discuss our stake in the food system. My name's Oliver Edelson. I'm an 18 and one of the leaders of the Plate of the Union Campus Challenge. So before we begin, I just want to describe sort of what Plate of the Union is. So earlier this year, I, along with other leaders of Growing Change, which is a farm to school education program run through the Dartmouth Center for Service, we received a grant from Plate of the Union to lead a food policy reform campaign on Dartmouth's campus in anticipation of this upcoming election. Plate of the Union is a collaborative campaign driven by the Union of Concerned Scientists, Food Policy Actions Education Fund, and the Heal Food Alliance to raise the voice of Americans who care about food and farm issues, especially during this election season. And this summer and fall, we've been executing an outreach and engagement campaign, and this event today culminates our challenge. So first, I want to acknowledge a few people who have been incredibly helpful in organizing not only this event, but the entire campaign. First off, the entire Growing Change team. You guys have been unbelievable in both supporting this campaign and ensuring that we continue our educational programs at Dothan Brook. Second is Daniel from Dartmouth Center for Service. This is not within his job description, but he has enthusiastically embraced this new mission of Growing Change. So thank you. Then Casey Wright and the Food Day team for your guidance. And then, of course, Professor Ann Kapuscinski. Where is she? There she is. For both your strategic guidance and, of course, your constant support for us and our entire team. Let's see. I don't want to forget anyone. Oh, I could not ever forget Kim Wind. Without her, we wouldn't be here today. She is really just so on top of everything and made sure that every logistic happened, and that's not a word, but that basically that everything happened. And then, of course, to our three panelists, not only for crossing the state line and coming here today, but also for dedicating your time to an event run by a bunch of students who may not be experts but are really, really excited about pursuing these issues. So thank you so much for being here today. And then I'm going to introduce each of them. So the first is Professor Laurie Ristino, who's the director of the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, and also an associate professor of law at Vermont Law School, where she joined in 2013. A little bit about the center. It has a dual mission to train the next generation of food and agricultural advocates and entrepreneurs, and also to create innovative legal tools supporting the new food movement. Before Vermont Law, she was a senior counsel with the Office of the General Counsel at the United States Department of Agriculture and USD. In Washington, D.C. She advised the Forest Service, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Department of Environmental and Natural Resource legal policy issues. She's also an expert on the conservation title of the Farm Bill and advised on the implementation of the 2002-2008 Farm Bills and also in the run-up to the last Farm Bill, the 2014 one. She previously taught the environmental agriculture course at George Washington University Law School. She's an associate member of the Environmental Law Institute, and she, as one of sort of the leading scholars and advocates for developing sustainable food system, she has an unbelievably deep understanding of the complex dynamics between agriculture and climate change. The second panelist in the center is Chuck Wooster, who's a proud member of the Dartmouth class of 1989. After working at a corporate job in Boston, he decided to apprentice on a farm, caretaker farm in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And then in 1999, he and his wife Sue purchased Sunrise Farm in White River. And in 2000, he started a CSA there with his brother. And then in 2012, he took up farming at Sunrise full-time. And Sunrise maintains a strong focus on land conservation and employing agroecological practices that preserve vital ecosystem services while also providing a benefit to 200 of its CSA members. He also is a freelance writer and is member of the board of the Upper Valley Land Trust, advisor to Valley Farm and Food, and a member of the select board in Hartford. And then the last panelist is Ben Falk. And Mr. Falk developed whole systems design, sort of as a land-based response to biological and cultural extinction and the increasing separation between people and elemental things. He is beautifully difficult to categorize. He's not simply an architect and landscape architect. Instead, his background in architecture, along with his experience as a designer, as a builder, as an ecologist, as a tree tender, he writes, and backcountry traveler, these all inform his approach to developing both landscapes and buildings. His home landscape and the whole systems design studio site in the Mad River Valley in Vermont serve as sort of a proving ground for the concept of regenerative land developments that his team's projects feature. He's conducted more than 300 site development consultations and has worked across the United States and across the world developing sites. He's also the author of a book, The Resilient Farm and Homestead. So, as you can tell, these are really, really dynamic and illustrious panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking because I don't have as much interesting stuff to say as they do. But we're first going to allow each of them about 5 minutes to talk about sort of very broadly what drove them to pursue what they're doing. Sort of as a lot of college students are here, we're all searching for that thing that will make us passionate and drive us to work every day. And so what we want to hear from you to start off with is sort of how you ended up in this field and sort of what drives you each day.
Shall I start?
Sure.
Okay, good. So that's such a metaphysical question. I'm going to go for it. So first of all, thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially because I don't have to cross the lines because I actually live in Hanover, so I'm very pleased to be here. So I actually practiced law for many years, 21 years. I was in D.C. I thought I was going to be a federal servant for my entire career. And then one day, this job advertisement came across my desk to start this new center. It was like a little bit less than $1 million, come up to Vermont. I'm actually just born in Boston, and I grew up in Massachusetts, and I never thought I'd come back to New England. Never say never. Sometimes you do go home. And I was on track to be a senior executive, which was like the highest level of civil service, and I didn't feel like I was reaching my potential as a human being. I was, entering my midlife. My kids were a little bit older, although still young, but not babies anymore. And I just, you get to that point sometimes in your life when you're like, well, I'm not really doing what I want to be doing. I'm not reaching my potential as a human being. I'm an idealist. I think I came out of the womb like, I'm an idealist. And I didn't, you just kind of feel that. You're like, I think that you understand the way the world is, but you know it needs to be different. And I didn't feel like, although I love public service and I'm a huge supporter of it, I felt like I had a really good portfolio. I did what I needed to do there, but it was time to move on and take a chance. So I did. I took a chance, and pretty much everything in my life changed when I moved up here, except even my car, although I didn't get a sports car. My children and my dogs remained with me, but everything else changed. And I don't, even though it was hard, because really making big changes in your life is sometimes very hard, but I found in my life there's no great reward if there isn't risk. And so I jumped in with both feet, and I have no regrets. And so that's my metaphysical answer. I could give you a more scholarly one, but sometimes life comes down to what you need to do and how you feel you can best be of service to the world.
Mm-hmm. Great. So as Oliver mentioned, I was in the class of 1989, and when I was sitting on your side of the table, I had no idea what I was going to do. And that was a very constant theme of my entire life. I knew I loved to be outside. I was very active in the outing club. I was an environmental studies major, earth sciences major, because they had field trips. It was kind of that simple. So really loved, now I look back and I realize, it was obvious to me that I needed to work outside. Like that was going to be the key to my life. But I didn't know that then because Dartmouth says you can do anything with your life, but they don't really encourage you to work outside for low money. So in my late 20s, I was down in Boston working for a wind power company. This felt like, this is great. It's a real job. It's in a field that I like. It's, supporting conservation environment. And after about 12 months of that, I thought I'm just not going to make it. Like I couldn't even imagine being 60 years old. It was just gone. So a friend of a friend of a friend, his parents ran this caretaker farm in Western Massachusetts. It was a CSA. I'd never heard of a CSA. It was organic. I knew what that was. I'd done a little bit of farm work in high school. It was picking rocks. It was awful. I hated it. It never crossed my mind to get into farming, ever. And so it was this kind of desperation, well, I'll go out and work on this farm for the summer and see what happens. And I'd been there about a day, and I just, like, the clouds cleared, like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. I don't know where I'm going to do it or how it's going to, but this is what I'm going to do. And I love it because there's unbelievable interest and angles and things going on. Like, there's never a dull day. Just when you think you have it figured out, then there's the weather, and the weather is constantly screwing up your plan. So there's never this moment of like, wow, I think I have this thing under control. It always feels like, wow, I know nothing about this. And the more I do it, the more I realize I really don't know anything about this. It'd be really great to know. So I love that aspect of it. I love the physical aspect of it. It can be a stressful job, but when you're outside working, it helps to work off that stress as well. So yeah, it started part-time for me. As you know, farming is not particularly lucrative, and so I had another job working at a forestry magazine where I had my health insurance, and that was my full-time gig, and that slowly, they let me work 4 days, and then 3 days, and then 2 days, and then finally they booted me out in 2012. So the farm has been on the land that we live in. It's just south of White River Junction. We raise chickens, lambs, pigs, and mostly organic vegetables. That's our main product. But more recently, to this question of conservation that we're going to get more to, we've driven by this beautiful field on Route 5 ever since we moved to this place, and always thought, oh my gosh, I hope something good happens to that field, like it doesn't get developed, because White River's pretty built up by Vermont standards. And so we're super worried about this field. So anyway, last summer it came on the market, and we said, we've got to buy this field. And so we got a big loan from an agricultural lender and bought this field, and we're in the process of expanding the farm, basically tripling the size of the farm. We'll be growing greens all winter in unheated greenhouses and selling them to the co-op here in Lebanon and White River. And the CSA will probably go up to maybe 300 members, and we'll raise, we'll see if we get more into this. We may actually build ourselves a little licensed animal slaughter room in our barn so that we could raise, we raise 1,000 chickens right now, which is what you can raise and still be exempt from inspection. But if we had a licensed building, we could raise many more chickens and lambs, and we think there's a market there. It's a little bit hard to see quite how it works financially, but I feel strongly that if we're going to conserve the Vermont hillsides, organic vegetables is not going to get it done, because most of Vermont is too steep for veggies. So we got to get some animals up there eating the grass. So we're kind of working on that piece of it.
So I think my path that's gotten me here is just trying to figure out what I want to do, which I'm still trying to figure out. This idea that, what are you going to do when we ask kids, what are you going to be when you grow up? It's really it's quite a messed up question if you really think about it, because only when you grow up do you really know how weird and stilted of a question that really is. So in my life, I think what I'm still trying to do is figure out how to follow my instinct, every day. And I'm really only realizing that's what it is now. And the life that I've kind of created for myself, and also been fortunate along the way too to be able to create, has been one of just trying to honor that instinct, to honor what I really am compelled to do, definitely not told to do. That didn't work out very well in high school or middle school. But what I not only want to do, but I'm compelled to do. Because want, I don't know, it's kind of a weak word, but what's compelling. And just like you said, Chuck, being outside was kind of the earliest thing I knew. I knew I didn't want to spend my days in, no offense taken, but a room like this. Or, this is actually quite nice for a room without windows, but I would be in high school and see the sun come out on a November day in Rochester, New York, where there's not much sun in November, and just be like, I have to go outside right now. I'm not going to miss that. I'm not going to miss what's going on. Mm-hmm. To me, the news is all outside. What I really want to know about the world is definitely out in the world. So that led me to be on a mountain guide track, because I got way into rock climbing in high school. I mean, the first thing I saw that I could be was when I read Walden and Thoreau, and I was like, that's cool. I want to do what this guy did. And then that was difficult to move in that direction. My parents weren't in supportive of that, that's for sure. So it was like, all right, what's the kind of way through? And being a mountain guide, kind of outdoor trip leader, led climbing and backpacking trips for summer camps, was moving towards being like a Knowles instructor. And then I found ecological design at UVM in Burlington through a course with Dr. John Todd. and realized that I could, kind of honor that famous quote by Buckminster Fuller that you can't change the world by opposing anything. You have to create the world you want to see and render that other world obsolete. There's no just opposition, just create a better way, model it. So to me, that's really, I guess, what I'm still trying to do, is make a life that's day to day what I think is the better world that we know is possible. So that means, living in a garden. That means growing a bunch of my food. It means being really active physically, engaging with the natural world, hopefully every day. Foraging food, especially in the last few years, have been really focused on how I can feed myself, not just saying this is what is going to grow in this part of the natural world, but actually realizing all of the food that's just around us, wildlands connections, and that's led to teaching. We run a lot of courses to the design business that I've run for 12 or so years now, a little longer than that, almost 15 years, where we help other people set up their landscape. Went to graduate school for landscape architecture. None of this college and grad school certainly was supposed to happen for me, because that's not my path, but it ended up that way. And yeah, small farming, homesteading, sharing that with people is kind of what it's ended up being.
Great. So I want to go from your personal backgrounds, into sort of a big, different question that's less personal, and it harkens back to the mission of what Plate of the Union is, and that's sort of the lack of a national food plan. That when we look at the system that you're all working within in some way, there sort of lacks an overarching goal of what our farms and the food we eat, sort of what's that mission. So if we take a look at our farm bill and our farm system, a lot of times looking at it, it seems like the main goal is an economic goal, is to sort of fuel people making money. But what do you think should be the mission and the purpose of our food system, of how we get farmers to people's plates? What's the main goal of that?
That's a big question.
I'll take a really quick stab just to get started. I think the main goal of agriculture should be protecting and enhancing our agricultural land. Like, that should be the number one job, and that's sort of a key element of organic agriculture. Is in agriculture, in organics, you're supposed to be feeding the soil, and then you get this wonderful byproduct of these great crops that you can sell. But your job is supposed to be soil protection and enhancement. So I would love to see us have an agricultural policy plan approach that celebrated and enhanced and improved our best soils as sort of a starting point. I'll just toss that in, see where that lands.
Yeah, I would add on to that too, to say, and can people hear me okay? It was a pretty small room.
Yeah,
I
great.
don't have to use the microphone. That I guess I see agriculture as a subset of a viable, sustainable way of living on the planet. So that agriculture needs to be subservient to the rules of ecology, the rules of nature, and that may be, and that's in conflict to some extent with the last 10,000 year history of agriculture. That's for sure. And so we need to really reassess it at the deepest levels, which may mean a lot more of a gardening approach than necessarily an agricultural approach. Not that I don't think there's a role for small farms, certainly, but that we need all ends, although maybe not industrial scale agriculture. I don't think we need it all, actually.
So should I jump in? Mm-hmm. I've got a lot of thoughts about this because I spent my career working on this, but it's such a complicated question. I completely agree with Chuck. I don't think the federal government says we have a policy of soil health, but we really don't. And we really have a policy, I think, of mitigated loss in terms of our of nature, and it's really based deeply in the history of this country, after from pre-colonial days onward. And I think, in some respects, I'm not talking about indigenous peoples, who I do think probably worked more with the land, and the new system, the European system came in, was very different. And so I don't really think we have a culture deeply in this country of sustainability and working with the land. And I think the new food movement, I think the food movement, as I think of it, started in the 60s, actually. But in John Todd and the Alchemy Institute that you kind of mentioned was really part of that movement. I think the fact that we're here today, this didn't happen when I was at University of Michigan in the 80s. This is a good thing, and so I hope that we seize the moment and we really dig down deep into what it means to produce food in a way that doesn't kill the earth.
And so then how would you envision sort of specific policy shifts within our Farm Bill to move away from this policy of, as you said, mitigated loss in nature to sort of having agricultural practices work in concert with sort of best ecological practices?
So I'm in this, I guess, moment of my life where I feel like I'm like in the practical phase, and it's really fun to talk about some of these bigger picture things. But I have some very like specific practical thoughts, and I think the number one thing we need to do is we need to price carbon. Like that would be an awesome thing for agriculture. We talk a lot about climate change, and rightly so. I don't think people quite understand how fossil fuel has distorted agriculture and continues to distort agriculture. So simply pricing carbon at a reasonable rate, which is probably 4 times or more what it is right now, would be a major development in terms of kind of restoring agriculture. And you've probably heard a lot, like in the economic terms, there's these things called externalities. Like we have this market, everyone loves the market. And the market's great, it really works well on the things that are included in the market. But of course, everybody in the market is trying to get their expenses out of the market. So as a farmer, one way you can do that is you can pollute the water and blah, blah, blah. It's not your problem per se inside your little business. And so we have all these negative externalities, and carbon is by far the biggest one. And if that were accurately priced, you would see a huge transition in the farm world just from that alone, if fossil fuel costs maybe 4 or 5 times what it does now. But that gets a little bit out of the philosophical sphere. I think, Ben, I appreciate what you were saying too.
I agree. That's a big one. It's obviously problematic for politically, to put it mildly. But just to also, I should mention with specificity, if one of the questions that Oliver you were asking in the beginning was, what concerns you the most? Is that part of that to me is just the distance, and I don't mean to change the conversation at all, but is the distancing of people from their food. I feel like most of what we need to see happen will happen if we all can get, or most of us can get just closer to our food. And so much of what's bad can also easily happen as we grow further and further and from our food. And obviously urbanization and modernization has been the trajectory of distancing ourselves from our food, catastrophically, as we've seen.
I agree with that. I do think engagement, I think one of the failures of the environmental movement has been consistent engagement with the Farm Bill. And that has been to a detriment, I think, to our federal policies. And so my hope is that with this, the fact that we're here today, that you all, it's really your job, I guess. No, but that you educate yourself really more deeply on what those policies are and don't resort to black and white thinking and really understand what the Farm Bill is and how it could be an amazing vehicle for greater change in our policies. And so I hope that the environmental movement, the food movement really starts to engage in that in a more deeply and nuanced way.
This last time around, I'm not sure, is Michael Pollan or Mark Bittman or maybe both, they talked about how if it were called the food bill and not the farm bill, then people would be interested in it. Because it feels like, farming, well, there's a couple of people doing that and they're over here and this is like their bill. But really, it's such a all-encompassing thing. I don't know.
We all eat.
And it's what Ben said too. It's essentially, we spent the last 150 years moving away from food. It became something that was, we had this mythological idea of this yeoman farmer, which is not the reality really in most cases. And so we have this great remove from the production of what we eat. And because of that, there's a great lack of transparency. We really don't know. I say to my students, we have abdicated the control of what we put in our bodies to corporations, literally. I mean, and doesn't that bother you?
Yeah. I think that sort of brings up this concept of, you talk about nudges at the supermarket, putting fruits in the front instead of junk food. But I also think there's this concept that people have started talking about, these sort of macro nudges that we need on a societal basis about sort of the concept of our culture on food and sort of how we can make these large-scale nudges that reduce sort of the sexiness of processed food and of not knowing and of the ease of just going to a supermarket and really forcing people to consider where their food comes from. Because I think that, and I don't know if you agree with that, but I think that is sort of the key to getting people to think about the Farm Bill and to thinking about where their food comes from and sort of the impacts that might have.
Yeah, it seems like, we base decisions right on like what's legal and what's like norms and taboos, like, right? We're driven like culturally and what we can, what we're forced to do. And legally, we've been not forced to do the right thing in general. And so that is a whole nother piece, is like, what can we make sexy? What can we make, taboo? What's cool, what's inspiring, what can be compelling for people. And I think right now we are in a period where finally like food is cool, like fresh food is cool. Being in a garden is pretty cool. It's healthy, it's vital. And stuff in plastic, isn't. Increasingly less so than at least in my lifetime. And that's not without its challenges, but that's a cultural shift. I don't know if the marketers will lead the way or the regulators will lead the way, but probably we need both, to make that shift.
One of those nudges you're talking about, I think, I do think it's important to realize that at the macro level, the deck is stacked against the type of food that we're looking for. Like, I think it's really important to recognize that. Fruits and vegetables are listed as a specialty crop by the USDA. It's like not even part of the main program. So actual food that people eat is this little subcategory, and that's kind of nutty in and of itself. So that's a policy question right there. Another like macro nudge would be, if transportation were pay as you go, that would make a huge difference in agriculture. Talking about this distance of how far we are away from our food. So back to like the economist, egghead thing, you have economy of scale. So the bigger the farm gets, the more efficient it is. The trade-off on that scale is transportation. At some point, transportation becomes so expensive that it's just cheaper to grow the food over there. So we as a nation, we subsidize the transportation side of the scales enormously. And some of it's direct subsidies, some of it is a lot of our highways from local to interstate are paid by taxpayers, not by users. Like, it wouldn't be hard in the days of Easy Pass, like every car has a little transponder, you pay it by the mile. Everybody does. If the farmers in California had to pay by the mile to bring their lettuce to the co-op in Hanover, that lettuce would not cost, $1.99 a head. It wouldn't. This transportation is a real cost, but it's external to the farm system. So we'd be eating a whole lot of lettuce that's a whole lot closer to where we are, even without any sort of moral, judgment or nudge that we might place on it, just simply if we change that policy piece.
Which I think leads us to we can all agree that the current paradigm, the way we subsidize our nation's food, is out of whack. Having less than 2% of our land be dedicated to fruits and vegetables, until this, in the Farm Bill, it makes it difficult to farm fruits and vegetables. There was a penalty, but what role do you envision, if at any, there is for subsidies to encourage beneficial behavior in the farming industry?
It's a huge role. And I think, this is one of your questions that you had on there. I think we do need a farm safety net, but I think it should be, we've always had one in this country, actually, since the Dust Bowl. But I think it should actually be a farm safety net for for producers who can't manage their risks as much as larger producers, and that we should tier those benefits to actual conservation practices that make sense. And we don't have that in this country. We actually the crop insurance is at cross purposes. We actually encourage poor farming practices, and then on the other hand, in the conservation title, we tried to clean that up. So what we need is people who are highly educated in beyond the typical farm groups. And I'm not a black and white thinker. I'm not saying be black and white. I'm not saying corporations are all evil. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I think there needs to be a nuanced understanding of how these things interplay and look at it like a system, and that we, the taxpayers, should be paying for practices and for farm safety that actually is of benefit to the people of the United States, and really looking at that. So there's a huge role. It's a big stick. It's a big fiscal stick, that Farm Bill, and we can make it a lot more efficient and effective for the overall food security health of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
I think the tough thing is it's not a coincidence that it's that way. That's the way it is today. It's a part of the scale and the corruption of the political system and power, the way the power structure is. So actually fixing that is to actually fix the democracy in this country. And that's just it's a big ball of wax. I mean, we obviously need to do it to fix food, to fix military, to fix anything, but it's opposing the existing power structure.
But I would argue that we let it happen. It's kind of our fault. So I don't really blame the corn growers or the soybean growers. I mean, they've been at this game. They have an interest in this, and I think that most Americans didn't really, just like, if it was a food bill, people would care. Well, I think now they might, but it's like people just didn't engage. So this is what happens. If you don't really understand your policies, if you don't, support groups that are really going to push, good practices and good policies, then you get what you get. It's a democracy. Yeah, there is politics. Of course there are. But, it's about really digging down and being in it for the long haul. And these groups have been in it for 75 years. And so we got a lot of catching up to do if you really want to change it.
One of the subsidy pieces, I think, a lot of the talk about the subsidies is to make food affordable. And I think that's a real mistake, because what it ends up being is you create these things like soft drinks and potato chips and stuff that are, quote, affordable, and increasingly we know that they're not good for you, among other problems. But that also means that if you're going to try and grow fruits and vegetables, your life's going to be harder, because why are people going to buy your stuff when they can just buy chips and things like that? So a much better use of the subsidies, I think, would be to make sure that people can afford food. So the money should go to the people so that they can buy good food. It shouldn't go to the producers to produce the stuff that's not good for us. So, let the farmers grow what they grow. It costs what it costs, and let's have a national policy to make sure that everybody can afford it. But that's almost like a non-farm bill, or maybe that'd be part of a food bill thing, or somehow. But I think that would be an interesting.
I agree with you, but I think it's both things. I think we need to support a conservation, really good practices on land and a diversified crop base, and SNAP actually is the majority of the Farm Bill. The supplemental food, nutrition assistance program used to be called, food stamps, but that is the vast majority of the Farm Bill, and that's how traditionally it's gotten passed, because the urban representatives and the rural people got together and they passed it, so from different interest groups. So it is actually a food and farm bill, and it's incredibly important, but we could shift that so that we do provide more access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and on the other hand, we actually encourage and support that, and we lower the barrier of things like crop insurance so that small diversified farmers can actually access those tools. It's not too onerous, and that it's easier and simplified. And right now, that's not the system that we have. These things, they would be difficult to do, but they are not impossible.
Yeah. So the most typical way to go when you're having a conversation about food systems and sort of the state of our broken food system is to automatically vilify sort of industrial agriculture, big ag, as sort of the enemy, as who we're fighting against. But do we think that surely the current system is out of whack, but is there a role for these large corporations in sort of a reformed system? And on the flip side, how can our policy work to ensure the survival and the thriving of sort of small producers and small farmers.
You're getting to what Ben said about Buckminster Fuller about trying to model the world that you want to see. I almost feel like focusing on the big corporations is maybe less helpful than realizing that, we've set up this market that doesn't work. Let's set the market up the way we want it to, and then kind of let it settle out. There will be big producers, I'm sure, and probably a role for them in some way. But it'd be different than it is now, where it's designed for those producers. I don't know. Maybe that's not radical enough. I'm willing to.
I mean, my concern is fundamentally with scale in a lot of ways, and feedback loops and disconnection of people to actions and consequences, right? I mean, this goes back to like philosophy class 101. It's like you do something, you experience feedback from it, and the bigger the scale of the system, the less direct that feedback is, and that's, I mean, tragedy of the commons, right? That's the catastrophe we're in now. I think in large part is because we can throw something down the Mississippi, and I don't know, the dead zone of the Mississippi doesn't affect me. Mm-hmm. It's just indirect, it's hard to see. So scale is, I think, at the root, but we can't just legislate scale. I agree with you that we can have a proper market, a market that produces things we want, not just many things we don't. And things will organically fit to that market. Mm-hmm. Not without its challenges.
Yeah, I think we'll always have conventional and large-scale agriculture, but the question is, not the question, it can be more sustainable, however, and we can progress our policies so that we have really no mid-sized farmers in America. There's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. And small and diversified farmers are coming up in certain areas, but it's super difficult because of scale, but also because of distribution, the whole kind of supply chain. So my goal would be to have a more diversified system in which different business models can coexist in a more sustainable fashion to feed the population.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we touched a little bit on the concept of shipping food. I think, Chuck, you were talking about this, of how the current paradigm sets it up so that we want large scale, and sort of the distribution is not a major consideration. But that's where lion's share of our food waste goes in production, distribution. So one thing that I've learned a lot about, and sort of you get nailed into when you take a class on ecological agriculture or something like this, is sort of the prospect, the ideal is this concept of regional food sheds, of sort of these geographic regions where you're able to produce, distribute, and sort of consume food all within sort of a small-ish region. Do you think that is sort of where our food system should head, is sort of envisioning these regional food sheds and sort of trying to create sort of connections and systems within those areas?
I mean, I think it's a sensible ideal. We can't get there overnight. And I agree that in any current manifestation of our world, we're not going to just have that alone. But where people have had vital regional food sheds, they've often lived very well and had amazing food and culture as a result. I think of places like in parts of Southern Europe that I've been, where there's still a very strong local food culture. Vermont's leading the way with that in a lot of ways. But yeah, it's a pretty sensible ideal, I think.
I was struck by something you said about about food waste. And I'm often struck at the farm, people will come and they'll see like a bunch of vegetables and stuff that we're about to till back into the ground or something, like this is all getting wasted. It may be that, a worm got it or whatever the deal was. And my response to that is it's not wasted. We're just going to send it around again. It's a little bit of it's unfortunate from an economic perspective, right, that we couldn't sell those things. But like when you're close to the land, when you're close to that source, like that food waste thing, food waste is compost, is your fertilizer for the next round. So if you can keep that scale at a sensible enough level, instead of losing whatever that incredible percentage of our food is, sitting in warehouses somewhere, that if you are a little bit closer to the action, then a lot of that food waste turns back into fertilizer quickly.
I think, going back to your the food shed question, I think that there's I think we're out of balance, and so I see these are complex issues, and I see answers to complex issues in terms of matrix solutions. Like it's not this or that; it's like a combination of things, which is harder to wrap your mind around. But that's how I view complex systems, and so. You know, we all don't want to be farmers. I don't want to be a farmer. I'm glad these guys are. But, and I'll buy his stuff. I was really happy when you said you're going to produce more greens in the winter. But, because it's hard to get that, the Upper Valley Co-op. But, that's awesome. But, you know, we're in a culture and we're multicultural, right? People want their avocados, or you want your kohlrabi, or whatever culture you come from. We're beyond the point of we're going to be living in colonial America and eating, you know, mutton and potatoes. So, but at the same time, we've ravaged local economies and the diversity there. And I think that Vermont is a lovely example of reinvigorating the local ag economy, and that we can do that. We can have better balance. There are some parts of the country that we shouldn't be tearing down trees and producing things, because it's not environmentally sustainable. We don't want to do clear cuts in the Northeast or other places. So it's what production should happen where, at what scale, in order, in order to benefit the community and benefit the environment. And that's a nuanced engagement with place and then place scaled to when you're looking across the country.
So I think that's a great place at which we should open it up to your questions, your comments, so that our panelists can answer.
All right. I just had a question about scale, and it sounds like all three of you were enthusiastic about small scale or mid scale. And I just see a disconnect a little bit between, if we're seeking to create an agriculture that is, at least in large part, a reflection of natural processes, as in it's building soil and it's sequestering carbon, et cetera. How do we acknowledge the fact that nature actually operates on much bigger than what we consider an industrial scale when ecosystems are intact, especially grassland ecosystems with herds of millions of animals and things like that?
Well, I think while nature is at a larger scale, I think everything occurs in local regions too. Things are all locally adapted. Every tree in every forest is the product of, as you know, local generational adaptation to that place. So I guess while nature occurs at a big scale, it also occurs at all of the micro scales all the time. So, I'm not exactly sure, I guess, what you're asking, but I think it's fractals, right? Everything's nested within everything else. Everything's occurring at smaller scales than we can imagine all the time. In the most nuanced ways, adapting themselves to the conditions of place. And that's how ecosystems are always functioning. So at its highest, our agriculture should be following that example. Does it mean we shouldn't have continental size herds of mob stocked animals because we know of the benefits that can result from that? Sure. I know Peter Allen, who you know, I'm sure, wants to get everyone's grazing animals in his town together as a mob and move through the whole town to mimic, savanna grazing systems. Cool idea. So there's an example of scaling up. Yeah. I mean, personally, I'm most excited about how do we scale things down. When people say, oh, that doesn't scale, I think, yeah, how does it scale down? But we generally mean, oh, how does that scale up?
Yeah, right.
I like to flip that on its head and say, no, let's scale it down.
Yeah, Joel Salatin's saying it has to scale both up and down.
Interesting.
For it to be sustainable.
Yeah.
I can't speak to a lot of the world's ecosystems, and it's a very interesting question. Speaking to the Vermont ecosystem, I think that agriculture has a part that is a net positive for the ecosystem as well as for humans. And it's a question of how much should there be, and there was a time when Vermont was 80% cleared, and you can still see the tremendous damage up on the hills that was done at that time. And now we're at 75% forested, 25% open. There's some number in there where we can we can be a productive and helpful piece of that. You know, there's more species diversity now in Vermont than there probably was before it was first cleared by Europeans. And you can argue whether that's a good thing or not. But the fact is there are more. There's many more grassland, you know, species than there were. So I think, without saying which is right and which is wrong, I think that there's a way in this ecosystem for agriculture to be a very productive and important part of the economy and source of our nutrition in a functioning, you know, ecosystem. Whether, you know, when the mountain lions and the wolves come back, I'm sure there'll be additional conversation about that. Yeah. But other than that, most of the, you know, almost the entire, you know, chain of being is still present in Vermont, which is kind of cool. So.
One of the things I talk about with my students is the fact that there's a reason why we have large-scale agriculture in America, and the economies of scale are crushing, or when you're small, it is, unless you can direct market or you have value add or something, or your premium product. So that's the reality, you know, and I want them to understand that. And so how can we use law and policy to give small or hyper-local or medium-sized producers a chance? And that's a different way of looking at that. But it is really hard to make it as a farmer unless you do, I mean, you do direct marketing, you've got CSA, and you've got a diversified operation, you're constantly diversifying. So it's a business, you know, and if you can't make it economically, even if you might be really sustainable, then you're not going to make it. And that's been the history of America. So I think there'll always be farming at all scales, and that'll be it. But like I said, I think it can be more sustainable. But I want my law and policy students to know that if people can't make a good living at it, it's not going to survive, and we really need to think about that.
One of the things that the Plate of the Union Campus Challenge has really focused on is raising awareness about food policy reform. And I'm curious what you guys think concrete steps that students can take, both on campus and in our future careers, to ensure that we're eating local foods and reforming food policy.
One great thing I think is, you know, eat it, right? That's an awesome thing about food, is that we are all interacting with it every day. So every time you eat a meal, you're voting for what type of agricultural system you're interested in having going forward. And so I think it's interesting to think of it that way. So, you know, to the extent that you have the time and the money in your life to be able to, you know, have to think about it that way, you can make a huge difference. It's really amazing. You know, we have 200 families who joined our CSA. That makes a huge difference. That's our livelihood. It's awesome. And that's, I mean, there's basically 80,000 people in Nipper Valley. So we're like 2%. No, is that, did I do math right? No, 0.2%. So like nobody, right? If almost nobody joins our CSA, that's enough. So as we go forth in our worlds, like, yeah, look for the food that you want to see. And if you're in a position to be able to afford it, buy it. That's an awesome thing.
I think because Chuck is an alum, you should always just answer first, so I don't have to look at him. Because you're like, where's it going? Yeah, I think, you know, the power of the purse is, but also being educated. I mean, it's a kind of theme for me. It's like really engage with food, and you know, not everybody can be a farmer, obviously. Most of you won't be, but you still can be engaged and interact with the source of production when you can, and I think that really makes a difference. And then for the first time in my career, I have people who come into school to be advocates for the food system, and that is extraordinary. And they're in all different ways. Even mainline environmental groups now have like programs for food systems, and this is just in the last 5 years. It's really extraordinary. So you don't necessarily have to go into food or be a farmer to continue to engage in this area, because food touches everything. If you're concerned about social justice, international relations, land grabs, climate change, food is involved in all those things. You can't escape it. So you all in business, you may, in fact, be able to do food products in business if you guys end up going to the Tuck School or wherever. So there's many different ways to engage wherever you end up.
And I think schools like universities are driven by student, noise and how much noise and what priorities the students set. Like, it's often been priorities to have the best, these universities are a business. They attract students by, look at our athletic facilities, or look at our library, or look at our student center. And it hasn't been, well, look at our food. And, what's more important than that? It's pretty high on the list. It's what, you sustain your brain energy with every day. But it's moving in that direction a little bit, but only to the extent that students organize and say, you invested however many hundreds of millions in this infrastructure this year. We invested a pittance in our sourcing our food, innovating our food sourcing. How is that congruent with the mission of the school? And you can very easily go from the top level mission of any university to that we need to support as much local, nutrient-dense, high-quality food that's serving the local ecosystems as possible just to serve our mission. And places that are organizing and doing that, in private schools and universities especially, are changing, how they source. In general, and it comes back to we spend very little on our food in this country. I think it's 10% the last I checked, 10 or 12, and in Europe it's 20, 24, 28%. We're used to going to the supermarket. It is expensive. But relatively, we're not putting as much of our paycheck as most people are towards their food.
I have equipment. I have to go. I got some rice seed before the store closes. But you mentioned climate change. I just want to throw it out for consideration, and I won't be able to stay and hear you discuss it. But I wonder how the question of scale will be impacted in transportation when Florida is underwater, because it seems to be headed in that direction. The Inconvenient Truth, which some of these young people may not have seen because it's so old, it's still out there. And when it rains down in Miami and the water doesn't go down the gutter, it comes up. So
Right.
that's hanging. That'll make a big difference.
It will
I
make
wish I
it.
could say here what you have to say.
Well, it's a good comment, and I'll go first for once. So yeah, it's the elephant in the room, really. And when I was at the USDA, I started actually, this is how old I am, during the first Bush administration, when the Anita Hill hearings, Clarence Thomas, it was something else. It was a real introduction to federal service, and then all the way through to the Obama's first time through, and during Bush 2, halfway through, we were still not allowed to acknowledge climate change. And the Forest Service was one of my clients. They were trying to do policy and planning to do succession for the forests, which have been suffering now for 20 years, and actually the majority of the Forest Service budget is spent on fire suppression. That's the majority. It's not about actually preserving the national forests, really. And so it's just kind of crisis management. So that's extraordinary. All those years, you're denied that. But I mean, the climate change is already happening. The fact that California finally is reckoned with the fact that they have no water, but it took them their entire history until recently to have a groundwater law, for goodness sake. So we are in denial in this country. The West is drying up. I mean, the West uses 90% of its water resources for agriculture. The majority of that is actually exported, our products there. So we do not, and the West is still growing. I mean, Phoenix is still growing, Denver's still growing, and they have no water. So, it's a limiting factor, but we have yet to really acknowledge that in America.
I think it's a super interesting question in Vermont, which is, more people don't live in Vermont because it's cold in the winter, and it's about to be not that cold in the winter, and it's already a great place to grow food, and it's about to be an even better place to grow food. It's going to have a huge impact on land use, just right around here,
Oh, for sure.
and it's going to be within our lifetimes too. It's not over the.
I always tell my students, if you want to invest in land, the Northeast would be good because we will have water according to the projections, and other places won't. So, and in fact, if you don't think it's happening now, it is. I mean, there are when I was in DC, I knew survivalists. I didn't know they were. You know, they're kind of closeted. I don't know. And they were like buying property up here and growing fruit trees. And I was like, oh my God, that's not the kind of world I want to live in. Like everybody's out there for their own, you know. But it's true. The patterns, and countries are recognizing that. Countries are buying up land, especially if they have growing populations. It's not to say there's like an evil force or anything, but you know, there's only so many resources in America. I actually think that natural resources and growing food, it's the new gold. It's like the new imperialism. Anyway, but if you do ever say that in a paper, you write a book, I do want you to give me credit. Just harken back to this. Put me in your iPhone. Laurie Ristino, professor of law at Vermont Law School, said it.
New gold.
The new gold. The new imperialism, people, is food and land.
Well, that brings up an important strategy back to it in terms of modeling. How do we model what's successful? Is we should be planning as if. We should be designing for climate change. We should be planting and making our farms for this craziness that is not just coming, but is already on. He's already here and coming further. And then as the problems get worse, because even if we change tomorrow, there's a lag time with a lot of this. They will be getting worse. We have resilient pockets that are spectacularly shining examples of, wow, they were planning this 20 years ago, and now they've got this system which can deal with drought or can deal with flood. And that's really at the core of what my business tries to do when it comes to land, is just adaptive design. Not trying to plug myself, but saying that's like the problems can be the solution. Like the catastrophe that this gentleman who walked out brought up, we need to see as a solution. Okay, great. Well, that'll finally wake us up to like, look, these people are doing awesome things. Maybe that has other benefits too. So, because we're not just going to fix it politically or economically, probably. So planning for that. And that's where the regional scale systems can shine as examples, because if they plan for these challenges.
I'm going to take this opportunity to sneak in a pet peeve of mine, which is meat. So you read a lot about how meat is like destroying the planet through climate change. And getting to this regional scale, if you look at Vermont, are we going to terrace Vermont and grow vegetables? Like ecologically speaking, what a disaster that would be. Growing meat around here, we don't have to feed it grain. You need grass all year round. We can have grass-fed meat right here, protein, nutrient-dense food grown right here. And in this era of climate change, when some of our lowlands are going to be lost in flooding, like Irene, for example, we need some of these upland areas to produce food for us, and we can do that. So I think as you go forth and think about these, you know, on the grand scale, the solution is always local. So it may make no sense in the world to cut down the Amazon to grow beef. I'm fully on board with that point of view. I also think, though, that not eating meat in Vermont is a troublesome approach, given the ecosystem that we have and the food that we produce here. So I'll just toss that in as a little firecracker.
Local is the new organic.
Right.
I have a question about going back to consumers. And, you know, as going to the store, as somebody that thinks about food and the food I eat, it's also very hard to, you know, buy the eggs that are $5.99 opposed to $1.99. It's always like the reach and like, you know, doing one of those. And, you know, there's close to 50 million Americans on SNAP benefits and eating the food that they can afford. And so my question is, you know, what is your message and what are your thoughts on how can we make that food more affordable and accessible to those communities that are under-resourced and, you know, could really benefit that the most?
Me?
I heard snap.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure a snap. That's a classic systems-based problem, right? So, you know, because you have to deal with not only our federal policies, but also accessibility as well. And so when you look at food deserts and access, and also if you do make things available, will people actually use them, and what are you making available? And so I think it's important. And actually, we're having Karen Washington. If anybody knows Karen Washington, she's a wonderful person. She's an urban food activist from the Bronx. James Beard Leadership Award winner. She's going to be at VLS. I met her on a trip to Cuba, and she started out being a physical therapist, and then realized that the people in the African American community were suffering from diabetes and obesity and dying, and there wasn't fresh fruit on the corner and vegetables. There was liquor stores, and it was kind of this entire system that was condemning an entire people to shortened lifespans and unhealthy ones at that. And so she's taken more of a systems-based approach to having gardens in the Bronx, really using spaces that have been abandoned and educating and doing education between neighbors and advocating for better policies and the applicability of and the ease of access of SNAP benefits and farmers markets, and bringing farmers markets to the boroughs in the neighborhoods that need them. So it's a package deal. It's not just changing one thing. It's looking at the entire system that's been entrenched for a while. That's my answer.
I feel this somewhat acutely because most of the people who work on our farm cannot afford our food. Largely, they're in college or recently out of college, not in a position to, spend $6 a dozen on eggs. And it's a real issue. I think in the Upper Valley we have some great systems in place for people who are truly needy and not able to buy food, that they can get a fair bit of local food through Willing Hands. There's a couple of great nonprofits that are helping to make that happen. But if you're working for $10 an hour, $12 an hour, which a lot of people are, like, how do you get access to that food? And I think, it's a little bit of a punt, but I completely agree with you that it's a systemic problem. Like, that's a big problem of that needs to be addressed to some extent at a systemic level. But I do think also that people don't need to buy, the good stuff, whatever that's defined as, all the time to still have it be good. And so for some people it might be, once a month, I'm going to buy a local burger or some local veggies or a dozen eggs. Like once a month I'm going to buy the good dozen. And so for some, that may be just the right answer. And because we're at this point where so few people are eating local food, like if everybody did like one day a month, like, wow, there's going to be farms all over the place. So I do think it's a little bit of a trade-off that we need to stay focused on the big solution. And at the same time, we can't therefore not pursue the small solutions that we all have in our grasp, whatever that grasp may be.
And I think that's a good metric. Like, the better our system's doing, the more affordable great food will be. Like, that can be a metric that rates it all. I mean, but I think, to reiterate, I mean, it is totally systemic. Everything has to do with that. The externalities is a big one. If we just rig the economy in a trajectory that took into account the damages that is created that no one's paying for, instead of the way it is right now, that would help that.
Right.
Urban planning affects everything that's being mentioned and more. One thing that people can do sometimes, not often, but the less you make per hour, the more potent it is for you to actually have a raised bed garden, or one raised bed, grow some of your own food. I know a lot of people don't have access to even a sunny plot of land to do that on, but for those who do, that's one just action people can take on their own. Where, I mean, I figured that growing my own vegetables a few years ago, I was like, I do this for fun, I do it for health, I do it for enjoyment, but I'm probably paying myself $3 an hour. I added up all the food I grew, and it was over $20 an hour, the amount of time I had into it for the food on my shelves. For most of what I grew, garlic, squash, cabbage, the main stuff. So I was like, that's actually better than a lot of people get paid. Now I have land, and I pay taxes on that land, so there's other problems to that. It's not quite that simple. But there are people who don't make a lot of money, who make very little money, who do have access to a sunny plot of land that no one's doing anything on. So there's a skilling up there too that can address that, and an empowerment of people that can be just from like, hey, here's how you grow, here's how you make a raised bed for cheap, and here's how $2 a seed you can grow $2,000 worth of food. So that's something that can happen too, and that is happening.
Yes.
Urban agriculture.
Yep.
My question actually segues like perfectly into that. So like as we move further towards urbanization and modernization, and that space component and that sunlight component and the soil component all become a lot more difficult to do see people moving closer to their food when they're moving further away from it, almost.
Well, it's already happened. I mean, we have moved away, and I think we really waste land and resources in this country. It's been our history to kind of, economic growth is about development, and I think it's kind of, we can no longer afford to do that. So I think there's a lot of space. I mean, the whole urban garden movement and the rooftop movement, like in Brooklyn Grange, and people are doing those kind of things. I mean, there's space, there is land, there are resources there. We need to care for the land better. I mean, to me, that's like a foundational, and I think we would all agree about that. We've really had a process in America about really destroying land in a way that is just not sustainable. So we have amazing resources in this country if we kind of rethink how we approach natural resources.
A couple of years ago, there was a discussion about could the Upper Valley grow its own food? Like, do we have enough land? And I said, definitely. And somebody said, well, there's only like 8 farms. And I was like, have you seen the size of the lawns around here? It's like this shift of thinking, right? Yeah. So whether that gets, how Brooklyn fits into that with rooftop, but if we had that idea of like, if our goal were to grow food, we could grow a ton of food all over the U.S., like in the suburbs. You're pretty close. Pretty close in.
Retrofitting the suburbs is going to be, there's going to be a million jobs there if we decide to actually do it. And eventually we'll have to, or we'll just leave, they'll just be left, and they'll be like Detroit everywhere. So we'll need to, unless there's huge depopulating events, which also may be the case. But yeah, I mean, Japan, Edo period Japan is a reference I use in my work. In the 1700s, Japan was very isolationist, and they definitely lived on 2 acres per person, and that includes forest land. So, and they were cool climate in large part. Totally cool. And if the Upper Valley couldn't feed itself, like, throw in the towel. Like, the world can't feed itself. Right. Good luck. New York can't feed itself with vertical gardening and rooftop gardens. That's sometimes a little bit of a panacea. Like, great, do it. But, you got 60 stories of people. Yeah. There's no miracles. But rural places, suburbs, could, be micro farm heaven. I mean, look at the Victory Garden. Here's a scale and a decentralization, and kind of, as John Todd says, we need to break apart and disaggregate the problems if we're going to solve any of these things. We're not going to just solve whole, problems taken whole. In the Victory Garden movement, the nation grew immediately, literally almost overnight, 40% of its own produce in short order, just because it was a patriotic, wartime thing to do. And that's people's yards. That's not farms that ramped up. That was basically homesteading. That was gardening that ramped up. And if you look at the Russian dacha system, I mean, apparently still a good chunk, like upwards of half of people's calories come from their yards in rural Russia. You can't make a national agricultural system do that even in a 5-year period if you tried. To achieve things like that. So disaggregation is huge leverage.
Yeah, I think one last question.
I have a comment and a question. I think turn this on. I think it's on. It's on. No. A comment and a question. This year I built a raised bed 10 foot by 10 foot garden, and since the middle of June I've been eating tomatoes 2 meals a day, fresh homegrown tomatoes, 2 meals a day. And my family has made 62 pints of salsa so far.
I think that's going to be enough. We're all.
If you come to my house, you're getting salsa.
Yeah.
Okay. And that, in large part, is from our vegetable garden. So that was my comment. The question is, earlier you talked about preserving the farmland, preserving the quality of the land, and are there farms in the Upper Valley, land in the Upper Valley? I serve on the board of the Hanover Conservancy with Chuck's dad, and a lot of the land that we conserve is forested land, trails and forests. But of late, a significant portion of land is old farmland that we also try to conserve. And is it possible, which are basically meadows now, and you can build into the conservation easement, regular mowing of that to keep them fields and meadows. But is there a way to get some agricultural quality out of old farmland that gets conserved? And is there a way to incorporate that into all of this that you're talking about?
I'll speak a little bit to that just because I think about that all the time. So getting back to this meat question. So the problem with meat is that industrial meat is so ruinous. So in the vegetable world, we all kind of grow vegetables the same way. I grow them, and people in California, like we put them in rows, we plant them, we weed them, we water them, we harvest them. It's kind of the same thing, just a question of scale. Meat is totally different. In my farm, animals wander around outside, the sunlight hits the ground, they eat the grass. In the industrial system, the animals are inside. They never go out, they never eat grass. And the price difference is so huge that it's basically destroyed the local market for meat. There almost is no local market for meat. There are some people who will pay $7 a pound for hamburger, who will pay $12 a pound for lamb, and who will pay $4 a pound for chicken. And we need those people because they're keeping that part of our business alive. But generally speaking, people will pay maybe $3 for a head of lettuce instead of $2, but they're not going to pay $12 for lamb when they can pay $2 for beef. They're just not. It's like too big of a spread. And so until we figure out the meat thing, those meadows, it's a huge problem because the best way to conserve all those meadows would be to have them have an economic value in our system. It's unless it's perfectly flat and near a farm, it just doesn't make sense for a farm to go and raise squash and things on there. You need water, you need fence, you have to keep the deer out, all this kind of stuff. It's not that hard to put animals on there with some electric fence, and it's like it's back to that mob grazing thing. Tremendous. There ought to be an economic model that somebody could have 20 meadows in Hanover that are sort of under their jurisdiction, and they've got their map and they bring their animals and they move them around. But the economics of that are just punishing at this point.
Unless you have a real premium market. But then we're back to people who are wealthy, who can only afford these products. I would say, though, it's somebody who does knows something about conservation easements. I think it's a mistake to make requirements and easements where people have to do certain sorts of production, because then you really kind of limit, I think, the long-term viability of the land. But it's great to keep the idea open that, you could have, with proper conservation practices, different sorts of agricultural practices on land. But I think the economies of scale there are killer.
It could be reasonable to plant things like apple and pear trees in those places. Let the local deer herd graze it down because they're attracted by those trees, and so they help with the meadow ecosystem, because you have a grazing impact, but it's wildlife, because wildlife has its own grazing impact, as we've seen quite heavily in places. We don't just have to graze domestic animals, especially where you have a lot of deer. It can be a problem. There's a solution there, and you can also make those tracts of land like publicly available to like gleaning or harvesting by people who may not have land. Like go harvest 100 pounds of apples. They could have a social function.
Great. She gets a question no matter.
That's right.
She's the boss.
She's the boss.
Yeah.
So I wanted to first of all just thank everybody for a lot of really creative ideas and great questions like the one that you just asked. But as I'm hearing you talk about the obstacles, like the most recent examples, Chuck, you just pointed out this, impossibility of having locally produced and sort of free-range meat compete with industrial meat. I keep coming back to kind of one of the reasons why I think the Plate of the Union initiative started, which is that we've got all these great ideas and tremendous bottom-up grassroots movement, lots of people doing stuff, but it's just, we shouldn't all have to work so hard at actually doing the right thing with our food system. So ultimately, we really have to find a way to have this bottom-up pressure connect to much better coordination at the federal level so that we remove these perverse subsidies. I mean, the reason why that industrial beef is so cheap, it actually shouldn't be that cheap. Even if you just did the real hard-nosed economics and didn't even consider all the environmental externalities, it's that cheap because of these obscene billions of dollars of worth of subsidies that are supporting that. And it's related to the point you made earlier about, if we put a price on carbon, a lot of that would go away. So I guess my question to all of you is, what are your thoughts on how can we better mobilize, taking advantage of things like Plate of the Union to really bang at the door of our national leaders? And maybe I'll just share one more fact. Plate of the Union, which is a coalition of a whole bunch of groups, they did a poll, I think this past summer or spring, and the poll showed with amazing numbers, like 65% voters across the spectrum, 81% voters across the spectrum, saying that they're, number one, appalled at the terrible damages of our food system on the health of children and other problems, and that they all want to see a change to a sustainable food system that is good for the environment and good for people and good for workers. So, we just got to figure out how to connect what the will of the people actually is to our national leaders. And as you probably all noticed, this issue of food didn't come up in any of the presidential debates. So, we're all participants in a democracy. What bright ideas do you all have also about what we can do to connect those dots? Because I think ultimately we have to do that, and we have to do it faster so that we can even do things like, Ben, your idea about promoting diversity and adapting to climate change so we're climate resilient systems, you're totally right. But we should actually have policies that are encouraging that and speeding that up, especially because agriculture could actually also help to mitigate climate change if we got it off of its addiction of the dependence on fossil fuels.
I would just offer that expecting it to come from the federal level is a little bit of a fool's errand, and it certainly has been. Not because it can't, but because the kind of control and power and money that makes these decisions makes it so that Chuck's meat is 3 times as expensive as someone else's meat is not something, we can't just go sit at those tables, but we can take the reins of local control. Vermont can say, we need GMO labeling. So sorry, corporations, you have to label GMOs in this state. And most people wouldn't buy GMOs if they see on a label, if they know. So that has a very powerful, local control, I think is fundamental. If it's not part of a decentralization and a local control on a political level, it's just totally dreamland to expect the kinds of policies we need from Washington, D.C. That's my opinion. It's based on the historical trajectory. The history bears that out. We can keep hoping that it's going to come from there, but I think ultimately it's states and regions saying, these are our laws, you need to follow our laws because we've decided this is best for our people if you're in this place. And not that progress can't be made in Washington, but there's a lot of false hope there.
I take a different tack. And what happens too is Vermont passes a law and then the Congress passes a law and it wipes away Vermont's law. So I actually believe in change at all levels, and I think that's critical. And I'll just harken back to my earlier comments. I think one of the reasons why we're in the state we're in is because people have not been engaged in national policies. And Plate of the Union and Union of Concerned Scientists, this is actually kind of a new initiative that they're having and really raising that up. And that's great. But I think we need more organizations that are proxies for citizens that will bind together along certain policy lines in the Farm Bill. Not just this time, but in a sustained movement. This is this is going to be a shock to you all. This has been a crazy presidential election cycle where not much substance has been said. I think getting something like this on the agenda, which is highly substantive, is extraordinarily difficult. So it just didn't happen. But I think the next Farm Bill is coming, though, in 2 years. And everybody's at the kind of national, at the local, regional, and national level, people are already starting to talk about this in organizations. I think it is critical that organizations that are like-minded come together in a highly coordinated fashion and don't abdicate control over that major omnibus opportunity to really shift our dialogue nationally. That's my plug.
Yeah, and Plate of the Union involves at least 50 groups, including the HELA lines, which brings together health, environment, agriculture, and labor. So I mean, I think what makes me hopeful is the sense I have is finally all these groups are realizing that in order to have the impact that you're saying is extremely hard, we need to get much better organized.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
to have, be aggregated so that it reaches the point that the politicians can no longer ignore you.
I think there's room at all levels. I know, for instance, in our town, we now have special zoning for prime ag land. So that's not enough, I don't think. Like we should be saying no more building on prime ag land, but we have got something, and that's an improvement. And I do think at the federal level it feels so daunting, but I also think that things have happened in the last 25 years that I would have thought were unimaginable when I was graduating from college, that this country has changed seemingly quickly. And I think your point about how this interest in local food, this understanding of what it means, is I think there's room for optimism. Yeah, but it does take. We have to exercise our democratic rights if it's at the town, state, national level. But if we do, things happen faster than I would have thought, and so that's maybe grounds for optimism.
I would have it. I mean, I never thought I'd be able to get married to my love, and I can legally get married, and I did on the grounds of the Vermont Law School. So my love and I did, so, which is awesome. It only took me 50 years, but finally it was sanctioned by the federal government. So there it is. I mean, never give up hope, never stop being active. We can change things.
I think that's a great place to end it today. So thank you all so much for coming. And thank you to our